And this.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sring Somo, and I'm the moderator for today's session, Impact of COVID-19 on Women-Specific Women-Led Organizations in the Immigrant and Refugee Sector, Serving Sector. I'm currently work as the Director of Employment and Training Programs for YWCA Toronto, and I'm also the co-chair of the OCASI Women's Caucus. Before we begin the session, I'd like to take a moment to make our land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that the land we are on today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa band. I am grateful to have this opportunity to work on this territory as we strive to build a more equitable and just city for all residents. So a couple of housekeeping notes. Just wanted to say that since this session is a webinar, we would like to request all our attendees to enter any questions or comments in the chat section. I think Sajide had earlier mentioned to all of you to please add your names, and we would love to know which organizations you're part of and the kind of work that you have been doing. So that would be really wonderful if you can share that on the chat section as well. As we go through this presentation, just wanted to inform you that we will have three main presentations from 4 speakers, and I will introduce each of the presentation and the speakers as we move along in the session. After each session or each presentation, if we have any time, a few general questions could be addressed to the speaker or speakers. Otherwise, we will open the floor for your questions and comments after the presentation. So in terms of just brief background on this session. Just wanted to mention that last year, during our internal discussions in the OCASI Women's Caucus, we acknowledged that the sector lacked disaggregated data on how women's organizations in settlement are faring, and to the extent to which our organizations have or have not lost ground due to the dire situation facing immigrants, refugees, and racialized women in this sector in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Therefore, in 2020, the OCASI Women's Caucus made a major recommendation to the OCASI Board of Directors. And this included a couple of things, including the importance of collecting disaggregated data on women and women's organizations within the immigrant and refugee sector, the collection of stories and cases of resilience of women and women's organizations at the ground level, and in determining if women have lost ground and whether there has been any erosion, if any, or gains, if possible, made by these women's organizations. We therefore commissioned Dr. Selina Abji and her colleagues Ashley Major and Roshni Himraj to study the impacts of COVID-19 on women-serving, women-led organizations across Ontario. We also conducted a separate survey of women-led women's organizations led by OCASI staff, Manoli Ekra, to gather additional information as well. The presentations today will provide an overview of the OCASI women serving agencies, as well as the results and recommendations of the study, as well as of the separate survey that was conducted. So let me first of all introduce you to our first speaker, Fatima Philippi. I'm sure many of you know Fatima. She is the current executive director of the Rexdale Women's Center, and she oversees a staff of more than 80 and provides services to more than 13,000 individuals on an annual basis. Fatima has been in the immigrant and women-serving sector since 1982 and has held a number of frontline positions and management positions and has been in the sector since 1980. For a graduate of University of Toronto, she has also acquired certification from the Canadian Society of Association Executives and Executive Directors Institute, York University Maitre Foundation. Fatima, of course, has extensive experience working with the not-for-profit board of directors and is currently also the director on the OCASI board of directors. Welcome, Fatima, and Fatima will present an overview of the women-serving organizations and women in the sector and about the OCASI Women's Caucus.
Thank you, Sring. Good morning, everybody. Wow, I'm a little bit overwhelmed when I saw this. I was talking with OCASI. We had 31 registrants and now we're at 125. So wow, amazing and welcome. I think that the interest in this workshop certainly speaks to the fact that there's been a lot of concern and a lot of conversation about how women have fared during the pandemic and have not done really well, and then that women and immigrant and racialized women have experienced the brunt of the negative impacts of the pandemic and COVID. But I just don't want to dwell on that too much today. And I just want to talk about a little bit of an overview of what our membership looks like in terms of the women serving organizations. And just recently, we've added a few more. Right now, currently at 41 out of 238, representing 17% of our membership. And this is an increase from last year. We were at 38 and we were at 16%. So it's a steady increase of women serving organizations that are now part of the OCASI membership. This by no means talks about the number of women serving organizations across Ontario. As I'm sure many of you know, there are many more out there and doing a lot of good work, but just to give a sense of the membership. And within that, the information within the membership, we know that 80 to 89% of our employees are female. And this was declared in the last OCASI compensation survey, and we have started even at that time to collect little bits of disaggregated data to understand what our sector looked like and what the workforce looked like within the OCASI membership. And we know this, and we see this ourselves when we look in our organizations, that women are clustered in the lower paying wage jobs and in the frontline service job sectors. This is no different than what's happening out in the private sector. We see the same correlation happening within the membership of the nonprofit organization that is in OCASI. And what's interesting is that we know that women clients within our organizations represent 65%, if not more, of the total clients served. And so we know that when our clients walk in the door, they tend to be predominantly women who first come to seek out services. And that's important to note that in terms of being client-centered, client-focused, it's important to understand who your clients are. And so we decided to dig in a little deeper because a lot of this talks about the funding of the sector and how women fare within the funding. And we've known from many studies through the Government of Canada, Stats Can and Wage, and also from numerous studies being done by private corporations. And just recently, the Canadian Women's Foundation conducted a survey in 2020, and that the women earn an average of 76.8 cents for every dollar earned by men in comparable positions. And that still speaks to the fact that we have to address the wage gap that continues to exist. And we're still almost one third behind, and not being able to catch up with that. In spite of all the studies, in spite of all the data that's out there, we're still having a lot of trouble. And unfortunately, I don't have 2021 census data. It's not yet available. And we're hoping to see, but the latest census talks about the Indigenous women working full-time earn an average of 35% less than non-Indigenous men, earning 65 cents to the dollar. The racialized women working full-time earn 33% less than racialized men, earning 67 cents to the dollar. And newcomer women working full-time earn 29% less than newcomer men, non-newcomer men, and earning 71 cents to the dollar. And women with disabilities in Canada earn 54 cents to the dollar when compared to non-disabled men, and experience a wage gap of around 46%. So it speaks again to the fact that, women's work and women's wages continue to remain low in spite of all the work that's being done, and in spite of all the services that are being delivered, and in spite of all the rhetoric. We still continue to see the fact that women continue to earn less and still carry the brunt of the work. And we saw that during the pandemic, that women, for the first time ever in a pandemic, in a crisis such as this, an economic crisis, that women, usually the last economic crisis, women were the first to be integrated back into the workforce. And now it's the opposite. Women are the last to be integrated back into the workforce, because they're also now being responsible for care of their children and care of their elderly family members, and therefore have a harder time integrating back into the workforce. And it's impossible to do all of those things. And so they're the ones being left out. And we're concerned that that's going to create even a further wage gap for women, and being more difficult for them to catch up. So I want to talk a little bit about the women leaders in our sector, and thinking about where we're at as well. And looking at the OCASI 2018 compensation survey, we have just done something recently, but it's not yet out. And so hopefully we'll get some of the newest data to compare this with what we have from last time. Women in senior executive leadership represent 65% of our membership. So we look at the total of the 238, we represent 65%. However, women earned an average of $56.41 versus the $59.04 earned by men in our sector. This was true in all of the categories. There were different categories for the number of employees. And for the categories for organizations that had employees from 1 to 20, women earned slightly more than men. But in every other category, when you go to 21 to 50 and 51 to 100, women tend to earn less than the men in those jobs. As the number of employees increases, so does the budget, and women earned less in spite of outnumbering men in the senior leadership positions in our sector. And BIPOC women represented even fewer, represented fewer numbers of women in our senior executive leadership within the OCASI membership. So you can see that disparities have intersectional issues related to race as well as gender. And we also know that women are still struggling, and women's organizations don't necessarily have the level of infrastructure needed in order to do the work that they need to get done. So I think it's, looking at who we are, we've come a long way, but there's still a long way to go. And I think when we're talking about how we position ourselves and how we work with the OCASI Women's Caucus, it's important to understand what our membership looks like, what are the gaps, what are the challenges and the trends that we're experiencing, and how we as an OCASI membership, and in particularly women and the women serving organizations, the women working in this sector are keen on moving forward. Last time when we did our workshop, the women talked about leadership training. And this was definitely raised within the OCASI board. And we are going to be looking at hopefully trying to figure out a way how we can create leadership training within within an OCASI portfolio or a suite of services that we can deliver to the membership. So it's important to know that. And so I think this is what our sector is looking like. And I see today, and I'm looking at the list of participants that are here. Many of you, a shout out to, my own staff who are here, and many of you whom I know. And I see here, it's no different. The majority who are here are women. And if we see that in the conference, we see that. But again, we continue to experience the challenges that we've been talking about for the last 30 years, and wondering why that continues to happen, and looking at creative ways for us to address that. And so certainly the presentations that we have prepared for you today will give you some insights and hopefully create some strategic action for us to take on. So thank you. That's my presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Fatima, for that presentation and overview of the OCASI Women's Caucus, as well as some information, disaggregated information about women's wages, and also particularly women in this sector, the immigrant and refugee sector. So I just wanted to see if there were any really specific questions that you have for Fatima at this time. If you do, please could you just share that in the chat, and we'll try and facilitate that. But also we will definitely have an opportunity after all the presentations are made for any of your questions for any of the panelists. So I'm just going to see, I don't see any questions as of now, but if you do, please continue to add them into the chat as well. And we will certainly get to them after all the presentations are made. I'd like now to introduce you to our next two speakers. They will be making this presentation on the study that they recently conducted. Dr. Selina Abji is a sociologist and a research consultant based in Toronto. She holds a PhD from the University of Toronto and has published extensively on gender-based violence and precarious immigration status. For the past decade, Dr. Abji has provided research and evaluation services to feminist and immigrant-serving organizations, including needs assessments, stakeholder consultation, grant writing, and program evaluation. She's committed to addressing gender-based violence in all of its forms and works as a community organizer with the Rights of Non-Status Women Network, a grassroots anti-violence collective in Toronto. So welcome, Dr. Abji. And I wanted to also welcome Ashley Major. Ashley is a lawyer and consultant specializing in criminal law, human rights, and gender-based violence. She holds an advanced Master of Laws, specializing in international criminal law from the University of Leiden, the Netherlands, a Juris Doctor from the University of Toronto, and a Bachelor of Arts in Human Justice from the University of Regina. Ashley works as a research associate at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law and as a consultant with a feminist consultancy, the Thinking Forward Network. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you so much, Tsering. I'm just going to share our presentation. Okay, wonderful. So we are so delighted to be here to be able to present the research that we conducted along with our colleague Roshni on behalf of the OCASI Women's Caucus this past spring. And thank you, Fatima, for your opening remarks. I think that really kind of gives everyone an overview of the state of affairs that we were doing this research in. What you see on the screen is the title of the report, which I believe will soon be made available online, titled Leading the Settlement SHEcovery, Advancing an Intersectional Pandemic Recovery by Investing in Women-Serving, Women-Led Organizations in Ontario's Refugee and Immigrant-Serving Sector. And so our plan today is to give you a very high-level, quick overview of the research, which is always challenging to do. We'll tell you about what we did, what we learned, and the recommendations that potentially flow from that. And our hope is that we could use some of this discussion time today to really pick up on some of those recommendations and implications coming out of this research and discuss how members of the sector might want to use or share this research to help achieve your goals. So we'll start then. And Sarah, you can flag for us if anything comes up in the chat, or feel free to interrupt if there's anything that comes up. All right.
Certainly.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so what was the purpose of the research? Well, it was to study the impacts of COVID-19 as well as related public health measures on women's organizations in Ontario's refugee and immigrant serving sector. And this included, although the focus was on COVID-19, it included pre-existing issues that may have been exacerbated or mitigated even during the pandemic. And so we really thought about this at 3 levels. We were interested in the kinds of promising practices or ways that organizations were adapting to or responding to the needs of clients during this time. We also listened for key issues and challenges that organizations were experiencing both leading up to and during the pandemic. And we really sought to understand what resources or tools that organizations might need to build capacity for what we were calling resiliency in response to COVID-19 and over the long term. Okay, and so what did we do? Well, it was a qualitative study and a complement to the study that Manoli will be talking to you about, which was more quantitative. And it included an environmental scan of 150 reports, media articles, and scholarly sources. And then we used findings from that scan to conduct focus groups and interviews with 23 Women's Caucus member organizations as part of a qualitative study. Okay, so we'll now turn to highlights of the report that you see pictured here. So the title, while very long for a title, is meant to convey the main argument that we make in the report, namely that we need an intersectional pandemic recovery, or also known as a SHEcovery, from COVID-19. And that includes a specific intersectional SHEcovery by and for the settlement sector itself. Moreover, any settlement sector SHEcovery, we argue, must be led by women-serving, women-led organizations based on what we found in the research, right? And that requires intentional investment in those organizations, which we call in the report building systemic resiliency, rather than relying on the resiliency of individuals who work in the sector in the absence of robust systemic supports, as is often the case. And so how did we arrive at this overall argument? Okay, what you see on your screen is an outline of the findings that we'll zoom into in a moment, but you'll notice that this really became 2 studies merged into one. So we've got a part 1 and a part 2. So in the part 1, the situation was changing very rapidly between January and April 2021 when we did this research. And while we were doing the environmental scan, some of you might remember there was frantic activity around a national action plan on gender-based violence consultations that was happening at that time. This was also, if you can imagine, a pre-vaccine rollout period. I mean, that feels like 10 years ago, but it was really just the start of this year. And there were a lot of small studies and media reports that were being generated at this time. However, with the exception of some work being done by OCASI and the Women's Caucus, we really found very little data among those 150 sources on the impacts on women-serving, women-led organizations in the settlement sector specifically. So although there was lots coming out about what this is and how it's impacting communities, on the organizations themselves, a bit of a gap. And we'll talk about that. And so then in part 2, the data we collected through our conversations with Women's Caucus member organizations was very rich and nuanced. And in the report, we tried to feature as many quotes as possible to really showcase the experiences and analysis that members so generously shared with us. So really to try to fill that gap. And so as you'll see here, we divided our findings into 3 major sections. The first really unpacking the vital role and specialized knowledge that these organizations bring to the table before and during COVID. The second then honed in on those challenges that they experienced, and we used the tagline developed by OCASI's GBV project, this was already a crisis, to really show how pre-existing systemic inequities have prolonged and deepened the crisis for these organizations. And then the third section really gets into the kinds of resources and strategies that our key informants brought forward, which we describe, and we label this as a settlement SHEcovery. Okay, so I'll turn it over to Ashley now, who's going to share highlights from the first part of the report, the environmental scan. Over to you, Ashley.
Thanks, Selena, and good morning, everybody. So the environmental scan, like Selena said, we looked at those 150 sources and we're really, pulling out some of the key themes and information. And one of the first things that we saw was there was this disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on equity-seeking groups. So by race, gender, immigration status, and other factors. And so some of those early studies, there's one from June 2020 that was showing that newcomers, immigrants, and refugees made up 43.5% of the cases when only 25% of the Ontario population. And so already, even in those first months, we're seeing that overrepresentation in certain groups. And similarly, a study on Toronto itself showed that Black women in Toronto were 16% of cases when they were only 5% of the Toronto population. And so looking into that, we were trying to decide and figure out why that was. And there was a lot of really rich information on how certain individuals are centered in jobs that put them at higher risk. So women, especially minorities and immigrant women, were more likely to work in those frontline service and healthcare positions. So nurses and other healthcare workers or cashiers at grocery stores. And so what you're seeing is a lot of women were at that heightened risk. But then there's the flip side of this is that a lot of women were losing their jobs. And so women are disproportionately centered in the 5 C's, such as Canada refers to as cleaning, cashiering, clerical work, catering, and care work. And depending on where an individual finds themselves, they might be at the high risk of having COVID exposure, or they're at the high risk of losing their jobs. And so we're really seeing this 2 sides of a very dangerous coin for women, and particularly women of color in Canada. And so there were heavy job losses at the very beginning. 1.5 million women in Canada lost their jobs in the first 2 months. And this is levels that we haven't seen since the 1980s when women were really infusing into the workforce. And so a huge secession from the working world. Other themes that came out in terms of the impacts on individuals are that elder care and that child care. So as we are seeing people having to work from home, schools and daycares are shutting, there is a burden that is placed upon mothers and working women where they are responsible not only for their jobs, but also for this kind of sandwich generation of care of elders and children, which obviously has led to some of that loss of jobs. And underlying all of this, which came as no surprise to us, and I'm sure to anyone who works in this sector, is there was this shadow pandemic of gender-based violence. So as the economic circumstances worsened, as there was fear and lockdowns, we saw a skyrocketing of violence, and particularly for those women who are most vulnerable, non-status women. There were some very heightened risks for because of informal supports being shut down, and those non-governmental supports that they might have felt more comfortable accessing, but did not have access to when everything was in lockdown. On step 2 of our environmental scan, we were really engaging with the fact that we were seeing some rich information on impacts on service users, and it was very helpful to put that context, but we weren't really seeing as much on the organizations themselves. And so the ones that did emerge from organizations were really focused on gender-based violence sector organizations. And very helpful to see that. We were seeing there was this triple burden facing the workers in those organizations of facing COVID like the rest of us and the fears and stressors that come along with trying to adapt your workforce, the unpaid care work in the home, and then this risk of financial devastation that we're seeing from a sector that is already precarious and underfunded as is, and the impacts that that had when suddenly there was a crisis with so many more costs that were associated with trying to function during this time. So we really identified that the research was lacking examining women's organizations in the settlement sector. And that is where we wanted to really focus our second part of this study. Because we know that these organizations are a lifeline to the community that they support. And they are comprised largely of a racialized immigrant and female workforce. And that is why, as we went through these focus groups and we're really seeing the ways in which that knowledge and that resilience of the staff was so relied upon in trying to keep those communities connected and the impacts that has upon staff. And we definitely saw from the organizations that were identified that the Women's Caucus really exemplifies that role, that organizations like that across the country, but in Ontario for sure, that advocate for systems change and the real importance they have for the communities they serve. So that was our environmental scan, and I'll pass it back to Selena to talk about some of the findings from the focus groups.
Thank you, Ashley. It's definitely a skill to be able to summarize all of that research so succinctly. So thank you so much for that. Okay, so let's turn now to the qualitative study. So the report does tell you more about the research sample and methodology. I won't linger here too long. But overall, we had a decent representation of women's caucus organizations, including a good distribution of organizations by region, primary population served, and organization size. And we intentionally wanted to speak to organization leaders in this study, but future research might want to broaden this out to consider other perspectives, of frontline staff, perhaps clients, and others on these issues, but that was, the targeted focus of our sample. Okay, so let's work through some of these findings. And so the first major finding had to do with what we call the vital role played by women-serving, women-led settlement organizations in the pandemic response. And we called this pandemic response at the intersections. And so, like many other service organizations, the informants in our sample quickly pivoted. You remember that great pivot that happened in March of 2020? Pivoted their operations in response to COVID-19. So that's things like switching to virtual service delivery. I mean, we're probably really used to Zoom at this point, but it was brand new at that point. Staff working from home, in some cases adapting their sites to be able to safely offer what the government deemed essential services. But at the end of the day, really staying open and available for the communities that they were serving. And that was the primary focus. But through our analysis, we really were able to tease out the specialized knowledge that these organizations use to respond to critical gaps in public health measures. And so we organized these into three major categories. So first, when we listened carefully to their practices, we noticed how women-serving, women-led settlement organizations really use their analysis of the systemic barriers experienced by their clients to adapt their practices accordingly. So a very simple example of this was if you take, for example, the digital divide, right? So not everyone has Wi-Fi or a computer or their own personal phone. Not everyone is digitally literate. So a lot of work went into securing technology for clients and helping clients to access virtual spaces safely, particularly in the case of domestic or family violence and so on. Secondly, these organizations, and particularly the small organizations, were able to really leverage their networks and relationships of care with communities disproportionately impacted by COVID. So there was a lot of, translating of public health measures, building of trust around vaccine rollouts, just being a safe place for community members to call, especially, when other sources of support like churches or mosques or other places were shut down. And so that really became an important component that these organizations offered. And finally, we were able to tease out the role that lived experience played in this specialized knowledge. So it mattered that many of the staff and leaders of organizations were themselves part of equity-seeking groups. They could draw from their experiential knowledge. Many had to develop individual and collective forms of resilience because of the experiences of racism, sexism, trauma in their personal and professional lives. And so they very much, from what we were hearing, they leveraged this to really pivot and really do their best to support their communities. But that's not to say that there weren't challenges, but before we get into that, we have a lot of quotes that we used in the report. And so I wanted to share one of those quotes just to highlight here. It really shows how the pandemic was a time of learning and really drawing from that specialized knowledge. So I'll read it out. It was a time of huge learning, just huge learning. And I think you never know when someone kind of drops you in the middle of the Sahara or in the middle of the jungle, what you can do until you're there. So you look around and you think, oh, I had a flashlight. Oh, I had a penknife. I know how to tie a slip knot. And I think this was our version of having to really protect our clients' access to health on the drop of a dime, because for many, we are the one-stop shop. So I love how this participant uses the metaphor of being dropped into the Sahara Desert and what becomes really visible to them in a time of crisis. And so we were really able to showcase in the report the vital role played by these organizations through their knowledge, their networks, and their lived experiences. But circling back to those challenges, and this had to do with our second major finding in the report, where we talk about pre-existing systemic inequities that really intensified the impacts of COVID-19. So we know across the board that social service agencies in Ontario and indeed across Canada have experienced direct impacts on organizational capacity and staff mental health as a result of the pandemic, right? And the organizations in our sample were no different in that respect. However, above and beyond that, we were really able to tease out how pre-existing systemic inequities prolonged and deepened the impacts of COVID for the women-serving women-led settlement organizations in our sample. And we teased out, again, 3 levels of this impact. So 1, direct impacts on staff from equity-seeking groups, living and working in COVID hotspots, colleagues contracting COVID, and in some cases, unfortunately, dying from COVID. Many were struggling with balancing caregiving at home or not having a safe space or a private space at home to do their work. Some talked about the impacts of police violence and anti-Black racism, including the murder of George Floyd, if you remember, in 2020, and others, many others, having direct impacts on staff who were from affected communities. Also, the experiences of anti-Asian racism that spiked during this time, directly affecting members of these organizations. That was a huge layer of that challenge. There were also the vicarious impacts, which we know of care work with vulnerable communities. So, one person talked to us about how reading about domestic violence rates increasing under COVID in the newspaper in the morning is very different from being the person who's on the end of the phone line talking to the woman in that situation. Others talked about, helping refugees, over the phone, over the internet, who are waiting to come to Canada, but suddenly the borders are closed, and the impacts of that, that are long lasting, perhaps for generations. And then finally, a third and very strong theme that came up were what we call the pre-existing systemic inequities, that was already a crisis. So things like the gender pay gap, inequity in how funding is distributed, lack of an intersectional analysis in how settlement services are designed, all of these things kind of, that are pre-existing become intensified at this time. So for example, caps on transportation and daycare allowances for clients, right? Those disproportionately impact female clients compared to male clients, right? So there's already a stretch there. And lots of examples emerged about funding that hasn't been increased in 20 years, or having to meet increased needs of communities with, the same pool of money. And now there's a pandemic on top of it. So this really came through. And so many organizations were very grateful for the emergency funding, right? That did become available for some, but this was really, it was kind of barely scratching the surface of decades of underinvestment and inequity that was kind of underlying cracks in the infrastructure, as we tried to show in that image there. And so this, it really exposed the impacts of, for example, project funding versus the core funding that organizations desperately need. So not having the tech infrastructure, right? Having to cobble that together, not having the human resources infrastructure to respond to increase needs. All of these cracks in the social infrastructure became more pronounced at this time. And I'll give you another quote again that really highlighted for us those pre-existing systemic inequities. And this is from someone who'd been in the sector for a long time. So the women who I started with 40 years ago are still here, We're all getting older, and it's different this time. It's not this too shall pass with this government. This definitely has a different tone to it. Even the men in our sector are worried. They're not stressing as much as the women, but they're saying, is this going to be sustainable for us in the long run? We're tired. So our resiliency has its limits. It's like recycling. You can only recycle aluminum so many times before it starts to become brittle and fall apart. I think that's what can happen to the sector. You keep breaking it so much that it's going to fall apart. It's not easy to put back together. That's what scares me. And so in this, very poignant quote, it really pointed to us how much the sector relies on the labor and the individual resiliency of women serving women-led organizations, and how there are limits to that have been really tested during this time. But, we don't want to just stop there with the challenges. So let's talk now finally about the resources and, strategies that people talked about. So when we group together all of the individual strategies and visions for how to make things better, the need for a settlement SHEcovery really emerged as an overall theme. And so what we heard was a mix of hope and optimism among, some participants, and the same participants would also express fears of austerity and a scaling back, even of the limited emergency funding. So it's not like there was one group that was really hopeful and one group that was, really fearful. These were all kind of tangled together in people's comments to us. And so what were participants feeling hopeful about? Well, one participant described the pandemic as a teaching moment, and I quote, "The pandemic has given us a lesson. This pre-existing inequality cannot exist in society. COVID-19 affects everyone. Now everyone realizes that together we have to survive. We cannot survive alone. Now we feel momentum. We need inclusiveness. We need to work together in the recovery." End of quote. So, there's a real sense of an opening, a portal, if you will, into a possible alternative. But austerity measures, if introduced, would mean that we haven't learned the lessons that COVID has momentarily opened up for us. And in fact, as we'll turn to in a moment, the importance of core funding, which we saw as a strategy for building systemic resilience, really emerged as a major theme here. Another major theme as well is around, there was a real urgency around being at the decision-making table. So to build systemic resiliency, these organizations want their voices to be heard, to have decision-making power in redesigning systems to align with the rights of the most vulnerable for the collective good of all. And so I will now hand it back over to Ashley, who's going to take us into the end of this presentation with key implications from the research. So back over to you, Ashley.
Thanks, Lena. So the implications for government funders, policymakers, and sector leaders. So as we were saying throughout all of this, through the literature review and through our findings, we need to recognize and support the specialized knowledge that our workers have in this sector of the women serving women-led organizations. And recognition and support is tied in many ways to funding and as well to involvement throughout the life of policy development and through grant creation. There needs to be this recognition that there really is this knowledge that needs to be drawn upon to help serve the community that these organizations serve. And so where there are calls for proposals focused on improving women's social and economic empowerment, we need to give that weight to the organizations that primarily serve women. And creating meaningful opportunities to lead and participate in decision making. So this really came out through our discussion, was this frustration about being left off the table, or only certain organizations that were larger being included, or organizations primarily led by men having a voice at the table. And there's just this wealth of knowledge that comes from lived experience and comes from work experience that just is not being adequately used, and that has rippling impacts upon the health of the sector as a whole. Other implications, we need to build systemic resilience through long-term investments and core funding. And what we heard in so many really rich stories were just these organizations saying that we got a quick grant, or we had a really interesting area that we managed to convince someone to fund us for, and we had it for 6 months, and we hired really great staff, and we wrote one report, and then suddenly that funding was pulled, or the grant was over, and we had to cut that off. They described themselves as a bit of a starfish organization, where they would grow out an arm and then they had to hive it off and move into a different direction because of that lack of funding, or because of that focus on project funding. And had there been that kind of core operational funding, then that could have been continued on. And it also allows organizations to adequately plan for the future, and staff to have some security in their jobs where they're not necessarily having to move on with these small contracts and consulting gigs. And so really recognizing that the lack of that core funding has broad implications on the health of the sector and organizations themselves. The need to create policies that build that long-term capacity of women's organizations, including human rights, technological, administrative, or human resources, support. So again, there were a real disparity in the way that organizations felt they were prepared for moving remote, or changing the scope of their services, depending upon their circumstances beforehand. And so really investing in that kind of operational aspect of every organization is really key in allowing them to really be able to serve their clients. And then a few nested within here, but again, just investing in women's leadership and succession planning, investigating and addressing inequities in funding allocation and salaries, and using a gender-based analysis lens. So, tied together with this need to have an intersectional view and analysis of the ways in which these organizations are funded and the way that they operate, the disparities between larger and smaller organizations, or organizations primarily led by women versus men, really understanding the ways in which having that intersectional lens and looking at who's leading these organizations and the needs that they have to serve their clients really is needed to make sure that there is this recovery from this recession or the pandemic, but also moving forward more broadly in an underfunded sector. So that was very quick. There's obviously other recommendations and implications that we engaged with, but we really wanted to kind of give that high level overview. So we are pausing for questions and comments here, but I do know that we have another presentation, so I'll just check in to see what our plan is for questions.
Thank you, both of you. Wonderful. I really appreciate this skill of summarizing a 67-page comprehensive report into, a 15, 20 minutes presentation, but you did an excellent job out there. So really, really thank you very much, both of you. And again, I'm just going to check to see if there are any comments or questions, to both of you, Selena and Ashley. Sajda's sent out a note on the chat asking if anyone has any questions. So we'll just pause for a moment. But during this pause, I just wanted to say we will be sharing this comprehensive report as much as possible. We've shared it already with the OCASI Women's Caucus members, but we hope to share it with the larger sector and member organizations. And it's, I'm very, very impressed to see that we have already about 150 people joining this presentation today. So I'm hoping that all of you will be interested in reading the detailed qualitative research. The environmental scan of 150 reports and studies is commendable, and I think it might give a great great information that others could use as well. So I just see right now that Jamila from AXA has a comment, and if I could just read it aloud. It says multi-service organizations may not qualify for funding opportunities that are only focused on women's organizations, but the reality is that over 80% of our leadership and clientele are women. We hope that this will be considered in future funding opportunities. So any thoughts from either one of you?
I mean, I'll just say that I think, doing that gender-based plus analysis and having that intersectional analysis brought to bear on how funding is allocated. I mean, this just highlights for me, right? Like we get sliced and diced across singular categories. And so it's really important to kind of bring that analysis really deeply into how funding is allocated. So thank you for your comments.
And another comment, many of your findings are exactly spot on from what the discussions have consistent at our organization. And I'm not sure where Helen is from, but thank you, Helen, for that comment. I'm just going to record.
I'll just say it was a real honor to be able to hold space for these conversations. We know for some audiences, this is all stuff that we know already, right? So the question is, where do we want to take this? And how can we use this to make sure that it's common knowledge across the board?
Right. And just as a just a reminder to everyone, if you could just put yourself on mute in case you're not speaking, because we can hear some background noise to this conversation. Thank you, everyone. So again, I just wanted to mention to Selena and Ashley, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I think you spoke largely about the systemic resiliency that we really need to create. And for that, we hope that, those who are part of this presentation, but also our funders, the government, policy decision makers, leaders in the sector, can hear that message loud and clear about the importance of of systemic resiliency, particularly for women who are considered to be an equity-seeking group. Unfortunately, in recent discussions at the provincial level, this women as an equity group has been, again, as you said, slice and dice. But I also realized the intersectional nature of and some of the recommendations that you've made out there. So I'll just move on to our final speaker for the day. We have Manoli here, and if I could just read out her bio for all of you. Many of you working in the sector are already familiar with Manoli. Manoli is currently the Senior Coordinator of Policy and Research at the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants. She has a master's in local planning and community development from Paris, Sorbonne University. She has a history of working consulting in the non-for-profit sector in areas of international development, humanitarian aid, and research, and has volunteered for organizations like Oxfam and Aga Khan Foundation. Her current research and interest pertains to precarious livelihood, well-being, quality of life, and for advocating for more accessibility and inclusiveness, particularly for the most vulnerable people. And as I said earlier, Manoli will be presenting the findings from the survey that we again did with the OCASI Women's Caucus members. Manoli, please take it away.
Thank you, Sering. You will be putting the presentation, like the PowerPoint?
Yes, Fatima is in the process of putting that up. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So thank you for being here. And I know that a lot of things that have already been discussed in the first presentation, but like they said, my part of the survey was like more quantitative, and with a lot of information. So what how I will organize the presentation today will be just like an introduction with some details about the goal of the survey and who were the respondents, and also a general information, like I said, about who the women's organization are. And finally, I think I will spend more time on the impact of COVID with data on the women's organizations.
Sorry, quick question. Thank you, Manoli. Sorry, can people see the screen now? Yes?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
Okay.
So the next one, yeah. So like you said, so about this presentation, the focus of this survey was to not only collect data on their baseline condition, but also to better know who these organizations are. And the idea for the Women Caucus was to be able to have like to gather all information about the women's organization in one place. So the survey was first to be able to gather all this information in one place, but also regarding the context of COVID, to know also the specific impact of COVID-19 for women's organization in the settlement sector. So 54% of OCASI organization completed the survey. It means 22 out of 41. And we had respondents from like across Ontario and mainly from Toronto, 64%. About the general information, in the report, we had like more information. Here, I will just talk about the employees, like the employees demographic a little bit, but in the other PowerPoint shared with the Women Caucus, you have like more information about the details of the funding, who are the employees, the numbers, this kind of thing. So about the women's organization employee, they are largely, like Fatima told during her introduction, largely dominated by women. I think she gave some numbers from I think it was for the salary survey from 3 years ago. So here we have something like some data updated, and specifically with the women that the women's organization responding, and we have like 97% women, mostly racialized, and racialized average 68%, with an immigrant and refugees background average 64%. You have also indigenous and non-binary gender fluid. They're still a minority, but non-binary, the thing is that non-binary and gender fluid are not often identified. So it doesn't mean that this percentage is actually exact. It can be more, just because it's not, they are not very often identified. So about the impact of COVID on the sector, not the sector, on the sector, yes, but particularly on the women's organizations participating to this survey. As I will say, it's not very different from other organizations. The data is, the situation can be different depending on the size of the organization, the nature of the primary service offered. The thing with women organization is that mainly they serve women, and we will be able to see slightly like the difference, or what make them different from other like more general organizations. And but what they have in common is that COVID-19 had an unprecedented impact on human resources, presenting some challenges for all organizations, whatever the size is. And also, so we saw also some changes, like major changes in the way they deliver programs and service. And to give some percentage and some data, we can see, for example, on the right, I put in order like what was the most impactful impact was for them lost on volunteers. They said like 69%. And I will, in this part, I will sometimes, when I can, do some comparison with the result what we had last year, because last year OCASI did also another survey, but it was for all OCASI organizations about the impact of COVID-19. So keep in mind that it's not the same, okay, it's the same pandemic, but it's not the same context. Last year, when we did this survey, it was a few months at the beginning, you know, of the pandemic. When here we did that in, I think it was almost like 4 or 5 months ago. For example, when women organizations say that they lost 69% of the volunteers, for the rest of the members, it was 41%. So it's there is a gap here. Also, we see that they say that like 37% remained open, when for the rest of the at OCASI agencies, it was 19% remain open because of service deemed essential. So, and we can go to the next slide. We can see, no, the one before. We can see also that this it had like an impact not only on the way to work, so shift in the mode of operation, but also on the way to reach clients, and even the numbers in terms of clients served. So if in yes, 2 years ago, I'm like already lost with the years, but 2 years ago, they served 128,000 clients. Of course, last year, we saw this, they saw a decrease, like 11% decrease in 2020. And this decrease can be like explained by the fact that, you know, with COVID, they didn't have the newcomers coming last year. but also with all the challenges related to access to internet, digital literacy challenge, also struggle for families and economic struggle, but privacy issues also. They had like more difficulties to reach clients. But I saw that in the previous presentation, the presenters talk about hope, and you can see in the numbers here that they, despite this decrease, they expected or they expect more clients for this year. And maybe because the sectors is hoping for like Canada being like a bigger, like a full reopening, but also because some work has been done, I think, to allow more people to have access, or to find some alternative ways to get used to this emerging hybrid service delivery in the sector. So I already a little bit, I think, talk about human resource impact, but we can see more about it. So we asked them how many employees get laid off since the beginning of the pandemic, and they said 80. When I say it's just again the organization responding to this survey. 84 said no laid off, and 17 say yes. So when I do a comparison with what we had in the survey last year, it was 34% of OCASI organization had to lay off staff, either temporarily or permanently due to financial constraint. And here we have like some number like 11 and like 15 people being get led, but when you take a look to the numbers, like actual people losing job in the survey last year, we were talking about more about like 1,000, like more 1,000. It was almost 2,000. So percentage has a good way to compare things, but sometimes when you go in the actual numbers, is like two different stories. So, but it means also it's behind that like a story of resistance, resilience also. And also, I didn't put this data here, but in the other document, you can see, for example, that most of the women organization responding to this survey are actually not old organization, but not new organization. They have been here for 30 years, 40 years. So like they said previously, they saw a lot of crisis, and maybe we'll explain that gap. Also, we saw an impact, like economic impact. I think it's the next slide. Yes, financial impact. What I like, you have like 3 different columns here, and the first thing was like the question was, oh, did you see or have you experienced any drop in revenue? So since the beginning of the pandemic. The women organization said like 74% of respondents said no drop in revenue, compared to the over OCASI members. They saw at the beginning of the crisis 57% that actually experienced a drop in revenue. And then what I did was to see, okay, but where did we, this 62% who actually organizations seeing a drop in the revenue, where are they? And it happens that 100% of them are from Toronto, and so you have like the breakdown of the revenue, so up to like 16%, so like up to 5% drop. You have a 5% that actually saw more than 25%. So it's and then what I wanted to see exactly, okay, what kind of organization, okay, they are all from Toronto, but are we talking about the smallest, or you know, who has been hit by this drop? And it was interesting to see that it was kind of at 20% will have a revenue, I would say, from like up to 600,000, but also organization with the bigger revenue, and who have seen this drop in the revenue. And also, when we talk about like bigger organization, it's interesting. It was interesting also to go and to see, is it only in revenue, or also bigger in in size of like employees? And it was kind of I would say not the same, but it was touching at the same time organization with only or less than 20 employees, but also organization with more than 100 employees. So as a result of this drop, of course, of revenue, organization had to lay off staff temporarily or permanently. Oh, and I didn't say something about it. When we talk about drop of revenue, it's most of the time in this context due to revenue from user fees and also from fundraising. So we ask organization what worries them the most about COVID-19. Did I say 19? Yeah, 19 or similar future crisis. And it was interesting to see, again, it's a confirmation from what we saw in the previous study. It's all about, again and again, even if it's wording differently, about economic. They are worried about funding reality of the sector, economic repercussion, effect on workforce reduction in productivity. Well, this one is slightly different, but lack of appropriate resources, because it will mean for them to be maybe like more or less effective in the service given to clients. Organization ability to meet their financial obligation, 42%, low financial reserve. So it's like again and again and again and again in the top of the worries. It's all about financial impact of the crisis and what it means for the future of these organizations, and what impact it will have on the services to the clients. So about the challenges, and this table is interesting because we talk about priorities, like what was not. We talked just before about what was the worries were, but it's interesting to see here the priorities issues for affecting women's organization clients, and the table here. I try to keep the same wording used by the respondent, and it was an open questions. It wasn't like the other one with just but it was open, and it was interesting to be able to show you the wording used, and also what for them was the priority issues. So stuck with abuser, violence against women, issues increase, food security, housing, lack of technology, we heard that, access to resources, testing, vaccine, mental health issues, income strain, reducing options of living abuse, precarious and unsafe employment, not getting services from many legal supports, transportation, so social connections, high risk situation, and for someone unable to return to Canada, or also managing special arrangement in the home. So I think, yes. On this challenge here, it's different. It's specifically about digital technology. And we saw a little bit of that in the previous slide. But here, again, what I did was to, all you have like on your right is, again, it was an open question, which means that it's, again, a very direct answer. So it's interesting to see coming again and again, you know, like lack of technology, lack of access to internet, or clients do not have adequate laptops, lack of familiarity, loss of in-person contact, and you know, we saw that when COVID happened, we saw a shift. And we had like this move, like 100% of programs moved online for like most of the organization, even if some organizations have been able, because the services was deemed essential, to keep some services like in person, but most of them was doing the program online. And it forced organization like women's organization to be creative in supporting clients, but also employees with limited internet access to be creative and to, like, despite the challenges that the situation presented. And all these unexpected changes have a cost. And that's the reason why funding is so important and so crucial to leverage technology and build the capacity of the settlement sector and the women agencies in particular. In the next, in this part, I didn't want just to talk about challenges, but also about action taken, because they didn't just identify what the problem were, but also it was interesting to see what they did about it and what they did to address that. And regarding COVID, the question was, what is currently a priority for your organization? So it was interesting to see that they actually, on top of the actions, it was the same actions taken by other organization, OCASI organization, not only the women's one, but it was just in a different order. But it's all about communication to the clients, but also to let the staff know about the recovery measure, continuing to assess the current and future impact of COVID, but also do what is necessary to protect health and safety of the staff and clients. Because of the time, I won't go through all the priorities identified here, but I'm pretty sure we will share the PowerPoint. And also, in terms of action taken, we ask about financial. Oh no, it was good. It was the good one about financial and legal expertise. So we can see that 58% said that actually they did something about that. They invested in financial and legal expertise. But we can see also that even if 42% say no, actually all of them did something about it. So because we ask people saying no, we didn't invest in financial and legal expertise, but did you do something like attend? And they said yes, 100% of them actually attended information webinars. Also share information with other organizations, self-research legal and financial advice, and receive also pro bono legal financial aid. And when you compare this, the results to that same question about an investment in financial and legal expertise, the other organization, like OCASI organization, actually 68% say yes. So it's not too far from like the 58% saying yes, also like a women organization here saying yes. The next slide. And also, you know, because of the sensitive nature of women's organization work, we can understand why 100% of the respondents here took an action regarding security and, you know, in the collect and storage of information accessed remotely by staff. We asked them if they took what approach they took to pay staff who remain employed but are not able to work, who work remotely due to illness or caregiving needs. And we have like 68% saying that they are applying existing leave policy, or applying a new leave policy, 32%. So pretty much all of them took some action regarding this topic. And regarding accommodation, also upon returning to work. I think it's almost the end. Yes, we asked them as women's organizations, what kind of support, how do you support beyond pay initiative, both in caregiving? So they do that 74% by allowing those in caregiving roles to continue working remotely, 74% assessing staff requests on a one-to-one basis and providing alternative working accommodation based on individual needs. You have also rotation offered to staff, and also access or substitute for daycare needs, but it's 5% only. So this question, and I think I will finish on this one, it's interesting because we ask them what new ways of operating practice will make your organization better in the long run. So it can be kind of also a recommendation for organization about what to do and what to continue to reinforce. Donc, technology investment, new ways to serve the community and clients. So continue to be creative. Work flexibility, exploring non-traditional funding options. So I didn't talk a lot here about funding, but for sure it's something that needs to be, to be worked on to, to find new ways for organization not to be like too dependent. And also to be able to face like future crises, and also exploring social enterprise as a mean of income, and it's another way, and linear operations like 6%, like downsizing and cost savings. It's pretty much all for me here. And last thing, we will be sharing soon another another survey, but about the impact of COVID for all OCASI organization. But it will allow us and also the Women Caucus to actually do to compare the new data from 2021 with the data that we had for this survey this year. So it will be easier to do it like with data from the same year. And Fatima, you were talking about also the salary survey, and yeah, soon.
Great. Thank you so much, Manoli. Really appreciate this very detailed presentation of the survey. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate some of the comparisons you did make with the overall larger OCASI membership as well. And we really look forward to doing a little more comparison. I think that those comparisons might really tease out some of the specific issues that we might have for women-led women's organization as well. So we look forward to that as well. You mentioned a couple of things. You spoke about the drop in revenue, that it wasn't as large perhaps as the overall OCASI organization. And you specifically said that if there was a drop in, it was partly due to either fundraising issues or fee for service. And I think, I must say here and comment on the fact that many of us receive funding from IRCC and from our Ministry of Citizenship. And I think these funders have been very, very consistent in terms of maintaining that funding over this period. So I really want to take this opportunity to thank our funders as well for stabilizing the funding and for making all the accommodations that were required during this COVID period as well. We now have about 6 minutes if really want to stick to time. And I really want to take this opportunity to see if there are any questions for Manoli or any questions for Selena and Ashley at this stage. Please, again, as Sajid mentions, kindly put them in the chat and we'll facilitate that session as well. But in the meantime, I just wanted to again, speak directly to both Ashley, Selena, and Manoli, and ask them, while you were doing this study, again during COVID times, was there anything as a woman, that you could resonate with in terms of the findings, or if there were any challenges in particular that you might have had while you were doing this project? I don't know if the two of you would like to compare, your findings of the two different presentations. One was qualitative, one is quantitative, and see if there were any kind of bridges or similarities out there as well. So, I could start with Selena, Ashley, and then Manoli.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for that question. Were there any challenges? I mean, doing research in a pandemic is a challenge in and of itself. So I won't go down that rabbit hole, but I will say that I think we started off with the idea of resilience as a major theme, that, what would it take to build resilience? And I think what really resonated with me was, hearing people's stories. There's so much resiliency, but it's all, kind of this individual coming from that space. And I think being able to tease out the kind of the need for that systemic resiliency and to make that distinction was something that, was a powerful learning for us as we went through and we're analyzing the data. And we're really hopeful that kind of teasing out can be useful for others, because we certainly in the literature found a lot of critiques of how the idea of resiliency gets used to kind of justify underfunding. Oh, this is you're resilient, you can handle this, versus, saying how do we build resilient communities so that we don't have to lean so heavily on the labor of people who are, marginalized in these systems. So I think that really resonated with me. I don't know, Ashley, if you want to jump in or.
Sure. Yes, I think something that really stuck out in terms of trying to do the literature review was just how quickly COVID was evolving and trying to stay relevant and be on top of the latest reports and it was different in certain parts of the country. There was just like a lot of literature coming out on COVID, not necessarily what we were hoping for in terms of the organizational, but just COVID in general. There was lots and lots of writing. And so I think that's part of the reason why our literature review just ballooned. But, you know, just trying to really keep up with all of that as we were trying to hone in on the key aspects of what was an overwhelming shared experience for everyone who was living through this in their own way. And so, yeah, I would say that was certainly a challenge to try to make sure we navigated that and kept ourselves focused.
Yeah, you're really reminding me, Ashley, of like moments in the focus groups where people were like, I had forgotten what it was like in those first 2 weeks of the pandemic. So I think, you know, we forget how quickly and how rapidly things have changed and continue to shift and change. And so having these kind of moments to actually reflect. And also, maybe I'll just add one quick thing too, is that, you know, the people that we brought together, they were used to like conversing with each other, but it was always around advocating for clients. And I think it was really unique to have a space, you know, to be able to hold space for people to reflect on, you know, how is this affecting me as a leader in an organization and as a person with lived experience? How is this affecting my colleagues? There was a lot of really generative moments where people really appreciated hearing from their peers. And so if that kind of space could be created more often, I think there was a real value to that, just to be able to take stock of what was happening at that layer. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Selena. Manoli, do you want to add anything? We have 1 minute to go, but please. Can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry, I forgot.
Yeah.
No, I will just add I think what is very challenging for people doing research, actually, for the last 2 years almost, it's all this, you know, a lot of survey, and sometimes it's very challenging. For example, even if we know, and even organization knows that it's very important, for example, for the Women Caucus to participate to this kind of survey in order to know exactly the stories and where they are and all this data that I will be actually will serve and benefit them. On the moment, it's a real challenge for even for themselves to be able to participate. So I would say that yeah, it was a big issue, challenge to be able to have everybody participating.
Thank you very much. Great. And I see a comment and a question. Fatima, do you want to say anything about Tarana's comment about how we want to plan to use these stats and findings in the research?
Definitely. And one of the things that the Women's Caucus is looking at is creating infographics. We're going to be putting this up on, you know, settlement.org or SettleNet, and looking at ways to share this information among the women serving organizations across Ontario, to use this in a way that they can bring collective data to and make it local, do a comparison and what's happening on a collective perspective, all the women serving organizations, how we're doing, how we're faring, how we're not faring, and looking at how that applies to where they are in their own communities and trying to make it place-based. And definitely the Women's Caucus working with the board on different government tables, and you know, when we have representations, presentations to government representatives and bureaucrats, and using the data that we collect in a way that's going to have meaningful impact for the women serving organizations. So we can definitely post the next step plan out there and make that available to the full membership.
Excellent. And I am just going to really take a moment to thank all of you, all 4 of you, for this presentation. Really appreciate it. And thank all our attendees as well for being with us.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Have a great session.
Thank you.
Have the next session. Bye, everybody.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. I'm going to end the meeting now. Okay.
Thank you, David.